Hello, everyone. Thanks a lot for attending our Dataiku webinar today that will be focusing on ESG. So the topic of this session today is more specifically on how to accelerate ESG embedding in organization. Your speakers today are myself. I'm Anne-Sophie Rustler. I am Sales Director FSI at Dataiku, and Vincent Distakhlin is joining me today. He's our VP Data Science and Customer Success across the APJ region at Dataiku. Dataiku, in a nutshell, is a workbench for everyday AI, meaning that we enable business and technical teams to work together to produce optimal business results. The agenda for today is going to be, in the first part, focusing on defining ESG and how it's becoming the new must-do for, especially in FSI. What are the challenges related to that, and how you go from something that was more a promise to actually a fact, and how it's now more and more embedded in processes, offerings, etc., of FSI companies. And then we'll look at different use cases of our customers on how they have been able to accelerate on ESG with Dataiku, and what more broadly is we have experienced with customers on this particular topics. And Vincent will take you through a couple of use cases. So let's start with defining ESG and how it's becoming the new must-do for all financial institutions. ESG has really gotten over the year from a very niche offering in companies to something that needs to be more and more embedded in processes, in the strategy, in the overall offering of financial services. And this means concretely that those companies go from purely financial driven decision making to the integration of extra financial risks. Now, these extra financial risks are threefolded, obviously: environment, so anything around climate change, resource depletion, waste, pollution; social aspects, so working condition, employee relations, diversity, health, safety, local communities; and governance, bribery, corruption, board diversity, structure, tax strategy, all of that. This goes really this covers the entire spectrum of FSI companies. So that means, for instance, if you look at asset management, it means having a more ESG approach to managing money, managing assets. It means in the banking sector, for instance, stress testing on climate risks. It means for insurance company offering ESG integrated products. So it really covers a lot of different areas, basically. And there is currently and has been in the past I don't know, five to 10 years, an increasing push coming firstly from the customers, the shareholders, the investors, who expect financial services to provide them with ESG integrated products, with embedding ESG in their strategy, in their operations, and ultimately having an understanding of where their money is going and having an ESG component attached to that. So that's more and more the requirements from customers and from investors. But with that comes obviously regulatory expectations, and more, and EU is kind of at the forefront of that, but more and more we see regulatory instances having expectations and embedding new regulations around ESG. We can go to the next slide. So ESG, as a result, is now the core of the FSI transformation agenda. If we look at FSI, at financial services in the past, since 2008, the three key tendencies are, on one side, reinforcement of risk management and regulatory requirements, right? There has been an increasing number of regulations of risk management requirement since 2008. But at the same time, We're also shifting from a product-focused approach to a customer-centric approach. So customer centricity becomes an increasing expectations from the market. And at the same time, there is a strong need to constantly innovate, to adapt your offering, to keep with this constantly evolving market. And this innovation need, this need for agility, is sometimes almost contradictory with risk management and regulatory frameworks. And the last bit is on reducing costs. There is a big scrutiny around budget, around cost reduction these days in banks, in insurance companies. So you have to basically find a balance between these three different key requirements that are three priorities in FSI in general. Now, interestingly, ESG is part of all these elements. First of all, ESG is about regulatory changes. So I mentioned this already, and there is more and more regulations that are, expecting climate-related disclosures, responsible investment. APRA and ASIC in Australia have formulated those expectations. It's not yet implemented as a mandatory regulation, but expectations are that from 2024 onwards, it will be. There are organizations like Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures that is worldwide, and in Australia, it's a voluntary organization, so you can adhere to it as a company. In Australia, we see more and more companies that voluntarily are part of that and disclose climate related reports. So that's on the first bit. It's also about risk management and about, we can click again on the, thank you. And it's about the integration of extra financial criteria across all financial processes. So customer scoring, issuer scoring, corporate governance, all these things are now taken into account and embedded in companies. Around customer centricity, ESG is also key because, as I was explaining before, it is now an expectation of customers, of investors, of shareholders to have impact-oriented, comprehensive client advisory and services, and to have the FSI companies basically integrate ESG into their strategies and into their operations. It's also about innovation. This is related to customer centricity, but it's about development of new products, green bonds, transition bonds, social bonds, etc. Processes, so advisory across advisory, products, reporting, etc. And ultimately building an offering that is differentiating through unique ESG signals and models. Finally, on lowering cost of ESG innovations, it's about successfully upskilling existing professionals, lowering costs of external data, etc. So what I mean with that is, as companies, ESG is still very expensive to implement today because companies have to think about it in a way, asking themselves, how do I do it? Do I upskill my existing analytics team? Do I hire a new bunch of specialists that are only focused on ESG? How much data, external data, do I need to purchase? How big volumes of additional data do I need to actually implement ESG? How do I embed it in all my processes? This is extremely costly. And what we're looking at Dataiku is how basically, and it's critical for companies today, to lower the costs of ESG innovation because it's extremely expensive still. One last word on agility on this slide. It is key to have agility and stay agile in this environment. There are a couple of baselines in ESG, but it's still a world that's building itself. And it has very shifting grounds. It changes all the time. It has no consistent and uniform framework. So as companies build the capabilities to embed ESG in processes and make ESG-driven decisions, they also need to keep this agility and to be able to change over time. We can go to the next slides. So this is basically what we'll be looking at today with Vincent, and I'll let Vincent speak. We'll be looking here on the right. You can see a couple of logos of companies in FSI that we're working with worldwide. With many of these companies, we have ESG use cases in place. Vincent will mention a couple of them, and it really goes, across retail banking, investment banking, insurance, asset management, etc. So thanks. I'll let Vincent go more in the details on that.
Thank you, Anne-Sophie, for the introduction. So we're going to be looking at how those challenges around ESG, how those ultimately transformation targets work in practice. So what does an ESG framework look like when you're trying to embed that in an FSI organization? It really sort of follows the standard, I would say, analytics framework and life cycle, right? From data sources, obviously, down into taking action, and in this case, complying with a set of targets or regulations. Now, there are some specificities, obviously, with ESG, and we're going to go through some of those steps. First, data. ESG is very often a combination of internal data sources, right, on investment vehicles, for instance, but also a very strong focus on external data and providers that have specialized in providing, scores, benchmarks, emissions data, for instance, to be able to enrich the understanding that we have of ESG topics across the organization. Inclusion of external data is notoriously complicated because it means that there is, in this second step, a notion of integration, blending, reconciliation, and resolution of entities that can be quite significant. Making sense of external third-party data provider means that we have to reconcile, adapt, and transform it so that it fits our own hierarchy and sort of entities and the way we've structured our data models internal. So that integration is key, and a first step, a foundation to then building the necessary use cases. The second step or third step, I guess, here is really a holistic view to establish foundations for our ESG initiatives, which typically will mean, what's our methodology? How do we proceed, generally speaking, in terms of our operating model around ESG? What are our core analytics? What are we going to build and use as our analytics framework to be able to work on ESG topics? And perhaps more importantly, what's our baseline? Where are we currently? Regardless of use case, where are we today? That is the only way we can then measure improvement. What is our target? Are we targeting, for instance, net zero in 20, 30 years? And what's the cadence at which we will review our progress, our actuals with regards to our target? So that's really a company-wide, generally top-down approach to establishing the core modalities of our ESG transformation. Then we move into action, or I guess we could define it as use cases, right? Where and how do we apply ESG into our operating model? And we talked about some of that before: new product development, some better scoring, reporting. Some of those initiatives are listed here, some of the ones that we see perhaps more often. So things like ESG-based credit scoring, investment optimization, customer scoring, climate risk insurance. So all of those are core areas where we see ESG playing a very, very large role. And ultimately, this is up to every FSI organization to prioritize and then take action on each of those topics. Once we've delivered solutions around those use cases, it's really about a continuous loop of monitoring, reporting, and compliance, as well as, of course, backfeeding that entire life cycle into, okay, I've delivered V1 of an ESG investment optimization solution. How does that work? How does it help me track towards my target? And then going back to, okay, what new data could I improve? How do I integrate? How do I enhance my investment optimization solution, and then continue to deliver? All of those, of course, have interdependencies, and it's important to build with a long-term view and not build any of those in a very siloed manner. Now, the challenges that we very often see, and I think we've talked about that a little bit, but this really notion of foundations, right? As I said, you can't build those use cases on an ad hoc manner. There's a lot of reuse in terms of, for instance, the data sources that you may use for some of those different use cases, of the integration framework of linking data together from external providers and internal data sources. So what we would typically call entity resolution needs to be a holistic approach and not a one-shot, okay, this means this. And then the ability to really iterate quickly and ensure consistency across the entire pipeline. Those are foundations because they are independent of the use case, but there are capabilities that you will need in order to enhance and reduce the cost, as we've said, of ESG transformation. The second is scalability. And scalability needs to be thought of beforehand as you establish an ESG roadmap and take into account the most simple to most complex use case that you will want to do, and have what is the common denominator that helps you do not 1, 2, but 10, 15, or 100 ESG use cases in a year. Right? It needs a degree of integration across information. Siloed. It needs to have a focus on that banks, insurance having a positioning now, which is very strong on ESG compliant or future-proof investments. That is something that directly impacts the business and thus justifies the initiative in a very facilitated manner. And then answering the stakeholder needs. Talk about that in a bit more detail. It's a team sport. ESG requires involvement of many different personas across the organization. And so it needs to be able to answer our stakeholders' needs, from portfolio managers to compliance and regulation to responsible investment teams. So it needs to be a collaborative effort on what are the solutions that we build and how does it answer our needs. And then the last piece, which I think applies very broadly and not only to ESG, is really this notion of balancing agility and auditability, right? You want to go fast, but you also want to build future-proof assets. And especially within that realm of collaboration, you need to have and to speak a common language between, let's say, the builders or the people, for instance, inside of a responsible investment team, and the users or the beneficiaries, which can be a portfolio management team. If they don't understand the scores or the way that things have been benchmarked from an ESG perspective, then adoption will be low and there will be a disconnect inside of the organization. Right? So on end-to-end auditability, being able to evolve rapidly, because as Anne-Sophie said before, things are not set in stone right now. The world goes quickly, so your ability to evolve and adapt to new standards, new regulations is critical. Is impact not from an ESG impact standpoint, which is a key use case, but also in terms of how does all of this impact your organization? Are you doing it because you want to be compliant with regulation? Sure, everyone does. There's a high cost if you don't do it, but how do we measure the top line, bottom line, and reputation risk that is associated to good or bad ESG processes is something that's typically not done, but actually critical today. So just a quick focus as well on, some of those challenges. We've talked about it at a high level, but there are also challenges when it comes to, cracking the methodology, because there's no one size fits all approach, right? And if, for instance, we look at ESG for investments, inside of the family of investments, there are, different complexities that apply to different types of assets, right? So you've got here a, high level representation of, what does ESG scoring look like from a complexity perspective based on the type of asset, right? And, some of the challenges we see there, how do you manage hedging in a context of climate risk, right? So if you've got assets that are exposed to this kind of risk, how do you manage this kind of complexity? How do you manage controversy information in overall scoring, right? So reputation risk, controversy risk, those are, unstructured data by nature that have a very subjective aspect to them. So how do you integrate that into investment scoring? So, and once you start blending, obviously, asset classes in, investment portfolios, then that can become a bit of a headache. So, things that need to be taken into account before. There's no silver bullet, at least not today, when it comes to how you manage that. So once again, we come back to this argument of flexibility and auditability. So you're able to first quickly iterate if things need to be changed, but also be able to justify the entire thought process and scoring mechanism so that it can be understood, possibly challenged, and improved over time. So what does that mean in practice, and where do we come in with Dataiku? First are, to solve some of those challenges, I guess what we've learned from the field and what we would, typically consider best practices. One, it's all about your analytics methodology and framework, right? Ultimately, ESG is about analytics. If you have the right blend of skills, processes, platforms, and data, and you're already well positioned from an analytics innovation perspective, then there is a better chance for you to add ESG as a layer and an analytics initiative ultimately, and then reuse every experience framework that you have internally. So having the right analytics initiatives and frameworks in place are a huge help. Two, collaboration. I've said it before, it needs to bridge the gap between ESG experts, responsible investment, sustainable investment teams, data experts, business process owners, in order to avoid disconnect and to really make sure we're going from data to impact to actions in a way that is aligned ultimately. Three, no right answer, no silver bullet. We need to quickly adjust. And Sophie talked about all the evolving regulations around this. It is a sector that is growing, that is changing rapidly. So evolutivity, adaptability are key. And for governance, auditability are a must, and they typically integrate with your regulatory readiness. So from a Dataiku platform perspective, we've said it very briefly, but essentially Dataiku is a workbench, right? So a platform, it's not specifically an ESG platform, but it is specifically an analytics and AI acceleration platform, which means that from a project lifecycle perspective, you will be able to implement in a platform like Dataiku the right lifecycle, from data acquisition, internal, external, to blending those data sources, to building business rules and machine learning enabled applications, and then to push out the right visualizations, insights, reports, and data sets or scores inside of your organization. So some of the core capabilities of the tool are really around this end-to-end lifecycle and around acceleration, quick prototyping, enhancing processes through machine learning, as we'll see, is quite important in the context of ESG, and also operationalization, right? So push back all of the things that you've built, whether data sets, whether insights, whether scores themselves, back into the processes of the organizations. So this is a bit of a more detailed view. I'm not going to go into too much detail here, but really it's about data sets first. So where does Dataiku coming? Once you've got data from ESG vendors, being able to blend all of this, ensuring controls when you do that sort of entity resolution, making sure it's robust and making sure your data blending, data transformation is scalable. Then adding the business rules and the machine learning models to make sure that you have the right scores and you're essentially addressing the ESG use cases. And then from your golden copy of your ESG base, being able to fork out actionable insights, right? So modeling decision tools was an example of that, reports, and then embedding. So a couple of examples of, so apologies, some of them need to be anonymized for confidentiality reasons, but I'll try to say as much as I can here. So the first example is a use case that we did with Kairos, which you may be familiar with. They've done very, very interesting. So they're a data provider, right, around energy companies, for instance, right? So, critical piece of the ecosystem when it comes to ESG. So this is an example of integrating methane emissions alternative data into an ESG strategy. I won't go into detail, but methane emissions are largely underreported, and we've talked about the accuracy of ESG reports. So this is typically a key point of how do we include external data to make sure that we're improving the accuracy of our ESG benchmarks. So what happened with this customer was, from an external data perspective, we've got Kairos that's giving us scope 1, 2, and 3 for methane emissions, and especially for energy companies. Methane emissions. Then we've got carbon 4 for energy companies for scope 1, 2, and 3 of ESG. We've got controversies data from Sustainalytics, and we've got Morningstar for historical prices. The typical project in the Dataiku platform looks like what you have here in the middle, which is essentially a data processing workflow, right? With joins, entity resolution across the different data sources, creating of this golden copy, and then we use machine learning based techniques to optimize our portfolio, right? And across the chain, we've got the auditability through things like data blending, visualization, and we've created also what you can see at the top, an application for non-coders, less technical users, or portfolio managers, to be able to slice and dice, rerun, do what if analysis on this core foundational project. So you can see here the type of example of integrating data, creating insights as we go along, using machine learning in order to create scores, but very importantly, this notion of exposing the insights either through dashboards, right, and comparison of beta strategies, base index, and being able to give self-service analytics, what if simulation capabilities to users. The second use case that we've done, which we've actually turned into a what we call a business solution, right? So it's a ready-made Dataiku solution that you can use and then just implement with your own data very easily. So an accelerator ultimately for ESG, which is interactive document intelligence. So unstructured data is a key piece of being able to flag risk and to identify topics and sentiment for various organizations across ESG topics. And so the way we've built this was obviously based on a customer project that we did, and really encompasses both the pre-processing of documents, so typically PDFs or Word or text documents, topic modeling, right? So extracting, for instance, you can see things around consumer protection, community, and then window extraction and sentiment analysis, right? So on each of those topics inside of the document, we'll be able to understand, hey, this document or press release or financial report on company Y talks about consumer protection with a very positive sentiment, right? Or talks about social responsibility more than company X, right? So being able across a universe of unstructured data on a universe of companies ultimately to really be able to have powerful, actionable dashboards, and really to have a quick front end where people could come in and understand very quickly what is the reputation risk, or what is the focus from a communication perspective of a given organization. So as I said, business solution, you can find that on our website, for instance, for more information. Really meant to be an accelerator, built-in turnkey project that you can use. The last project is something that we did with the European ASX. So they're really trying to go from market operator to service provider, right? And so what that means is they're ultimately becoming ESG score, ESG benchmark providers, right? So a lot of their customers are typically keen on being able to have benchmark customization capabilities, right? And really to be able to understand big ESG index. So what they try to do we really try to build an agile environment for benchmark calibration. And it all starts with entity resolution across most of the ESG raw provider scores on the market, Sustainalytics, Moody's, ESG, Carbon4, and so on. So they really go from this massive universe of data into step-by-step resolving entities, i.e. joining across those different and diverse data sources, who are the same organizations and entities, and then being able to then filter that universe into specific dimensions, right? So CO2 momentum, for instance, other ESG factors that they are trying to do. Then they do benchmark testing based on specific diversification strategies, and then backtest the entire process. So really what was useful to them was this notion of agility, right? And they now have a 2-week release cycle when the market changes, or when some of the ultimately data sources, standards, benchmarks evolve, and it's full business ownership, right? So built by a team, but then through auditability transferred to a business team ultimately that can tweak, change, and run simulation. And they've really had this notion of scaling and reuse, right? So ultimately, without going into too many detail, a custom Python library that really can be quickly adapted and scaled to other use cases, to other entities, and to other markets. And in this notion of scalability, the size of the data and the type of product that they deliver through it was really massive. So that's in a nutshell the few projects that I wanted to talk to you about. I'll hand it back to Anne-Sophie for a closing remark, and thank you all for listening to me today.
Thanks very much, Vincent, and thank you all for attending this webinar. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope it was insightful. If you have any questions, comments, don't hesitate to reach out to us. You have my email on this page. Stay tuned for the next one. This is part of an FSI webinar series that we have launched this year at Dataiku. There will be plenty of different topics across the year. So we'll let you know, and we'll also write a follow-up email in which we'll send you a bit more material on ESG specifically, but also more broadly on what Dataiku does across the FSI sector. Thank you very much.